Hi, welcome to a brief video introduction on how I recommend reading journal articles in the peer-reviewed scientific literature. We're going to start with some basic rules, me telling you what to do. Well, you can feel free to ignore these. This is just my opinion based on reading hundreds and hundreds of journal articles, some of which I didn't really want to read, some of which I found were really fascinating, many of which I've spent far too much time reading. Anyway, here are my thoughts. First of all, do not start on page 1 and read through to the end. This is the worst way to approach a journal article. Most of the time you'll get very bored, you won't really be processing the information, you'll spend a lot of time for no return. Do start with the abstract. A well-written abstract should tell you most of the important things in an article in a very short, concise form, typically 300-word limit. So even before you download or print the article, scan the abstract. Is it worth downloading or printing? Is it relevant? Is it going to tell you what you need to know? Is it going to be helpful? Next, skim through the paper. Look at the introduction, the figures, the conclusions. Which are the important bits? Really, if you can't tell the most important parts of the paper, including the discussion and conclusions, from the pictures alone, then it's not a very well illustrated paper. Now, my experience here is almost entirely in geology. We tend to have nice illustrations, often pictures of rocks, even beautiful landscapes, volcanoes, and so on. Not every subject is so lucky to have such visual material to work with, but honestly, most of them are. Look at science, nature, you can have nicely illustrated 3D pictures of proteins or whatever. There's all kinds of cool diagrams you can draw, and if the authors didn't, they should have done. Next, once you've identified the key sections that you need to read in detail and you've thought of the questions that you want answered, then you can read the paper with a sense of purpose. Now, what do I mean by questions that you want answered? Well, you may be writing this for a term paper. Let's say you're a grad student in the solar system science class. You need to read about 10 papers and synthesize them into some current understanding of some process in the solar system, preferably with a couple of ideas of your own for how to extend current work and do something cool and exciting. Okay, in which case, your questions are going to be typically along the lines of, if they produce data, how did they measure the data? How was it obtained? Then, what assumptions did they make when they were interpreting the data or constructing their model, whether it be a numerical model or just a conceptual model? Do the data really justify the conclusions, or is it somewhat speculative? Usually, data are somewhat permissive of multiple interpretations, so the discussion section should really deal with that in some detail. These are the kind of questions you should be reading. You have these questions in mind, you read it, you want to know the answer to these questions. You have a purpose in reading the paper. Just sitting there reading a paper thinking, I need to generally learn something about impact cratering with no specific questions in mind is not usually going to go well. Finally, make notes immediately. Don't highlight. Highlighting is not useful. It really doesn't engage your brain. Annotations are very useful, either in a different Word document, something like that, or in the margins of the manuscript itself, or whatever. But make notes, write things down. That way the information gets processed in your brain. Personally, I recommend starting a file, some kind of document where you put all the references that you've looked at and your notes on them. Okay, now I've given you my wisdom, or not, anyway. It's what I think, having spent more than 20 years reading the peer-reviewed literature, how to read it efficiently and not waste time. Okay, let's take an example now. The example we're going to choose is a very, very short paper in Science by Schreiber et al., published in 1970, called Properties and Composition of Lunar Materials, Earth Analogies. And if you were in the class, then we did talk about this briefly in class. If you weren't in the class, then I recommend downloading it, reading it. It's a lot of fun. It's very short, and we can learn a few things from going through this. I'm going to read you the entire thing. If this was a 30-page review paper, I certainly wouldn't be doing that. We're going to go through it and look at the different parts of the paper and how we should read them. So first of all, we have a title, we have an abstract. The abstract is a very short, concise summary of all the important stuff in the paper. In this case, it goes like this. The sound velocity data for the lunar rocks were compared to numerous terrestrial rock types and were found to deviate widely from them. A group of terrestrial materials were found which have velocities comparable to those of the lunar rocks, but they do obey velocity-density relations proposed for Earth rocks. Okay, so we have a problem. The seismic data for lunar rocks, or the sound velocity data for lunar rocks, are quite different to Earth rocks. They found some other Earth materials which have seismic velocities comparable to those of lunar rocks and obeyed velocity-density relations proposed for Earth rocks. So this is quite promising. Could these materials be what the interior of the moon is made of? Of course, they're not going to tell you up front what the materials are, because that turns out to be quite entertaining. Okay, here's the full citation, by the way. Don't forget, always write down in your notes the journal, the volume, the page numbers, and the authors of the paper that you read, because you're going to put this in a reference list at the end of your term paper. Also, as I was often told as an undergrad, the most important part of any paper is in fact the reference list. We all stand on the shoulders of giants. Most papers make only small incremental increases in knowledge and understanding. Honestly, even those that get published in Science. And so having access to the previous body of knowledge that led to the current breakthrough advance, however small or modest it may be, is very useful. Okay, so here's the beginning of the paper, and I will just begin reading. Certain data from Apollo 11 and Apollo 12 missions present some difficulties in that they require explanations for the signals received by the lunar seismograph as a result of the impact of the lunar module, LEM, on the lunar surface. In particular, the observed signal does not resemble one due to an impulsive source, but exhibits a generally slow buildup of energy with time. In spite of the appearance of the returned lunar samples, the lunar seismic signal continued to ring for a remarkably long time, a characteristic of very high Q material. The lunar rocks, when studied in the laboratory, exhibited a low Q. Okay, two things here. First of all, we have citations to the literature. Second of all, what is Q, you should be asking, unless you're a seismologist, in which case you should already know the answer. Another point of interest to add here, this paper is published in June 1970 in Science, so this is only about a year after the first landing on the moon. Everything is really moon-centered, it's all very exciting. Reference number 1 is to a paper by Latham et al. In Science earlier in 1970 in January. As we'll see, that's the lunar issue. There were several more papers in Science that year. And in fact, we're going to turn to another Science paper by Latham et al., published a couple of issues after this paper, to explain what Q is. So, in case you want to track it down, this is from November 1970, Seismic Data from Man-Made Impacts on the Moon by Latham et al. Q is the quality factor. So attenuation of energy in a vibrating system is frequently specified by the quantity Q, or quality factor, for the system. 1 over Q is the dissipation function, where 2 pi over Q is the fractional loss of energy per cycle of vibration of the system. Thus, a high Q implies low attenuation. The Q of a system can be determined by measuring the rate of decay of system energy with time. Okay, hopefully that all makes sense. So basically, a high Q means a low seismic attenuation. We have these long, ringing seismic vibrations that suggest a high Q. Okay, the problem we have is that the lunar rocks, when studied in the laboratory, had a low Q. Let's continue there from the bottom of that page. Perhaps most startling of all, however, was the very low sound velocity indicated for the outer lunar layer deduced from the LEM impact signal. The data obtained on the lunar rocks and finds agree well with the results of the Apollo 12 seismic experiment. Finds, by the way, means soil and dust. These rock velocities are startlingly low. The measured velocities on a vesicular medium-grained igneous rock, 10017, having a bulk density of 3.2 grams per centimeter cubed were Vp equals 1.84 and Vs equals 1.05 kilometers per second. The results for a microbreccia, 10046, with a bulk density of 2.2 grams per centimeter cubed were Vp equals 1.25 and Vs equals 0.74 kilometers per second for the compressional Vp and shear Vs velocities. Okay, at this point we turn to Table 1. So the first thing to note is that when you start presenting a lot of results in the text, in sentences, it gets very hard to follow. actual data are much better illustrated in either tables or preferably figures, or ideally tables and figures. Okay, so here table 1 includes the P wave velocities, that's the pressure or longitudinal seismic velocities in kilometers per second, of a whole bunch of, on the right, minerals, then from there, moving left, igneous rocks, metamorphic rocks, sedimentary rocks, and all those 3 rock suites are from Earth, and then finally lunar rocks and our Earth materials, which are, as it turns out, a whole bunch of different kinds of cheese. The actual measurements of lunar rock 10017 and 10046 were in fact published previously by the same authors, Schreiber et al., in the same journal, Science, but in the Moon issue in January, whereas our current paper was a few months later. Clearly they were still feeling rather giddy and excited at the initial results from the Moon, and decided to do this cheese paper. But anyway, so the important thing here is that the cheese and the Moon rocks have velocities in the range 1.2 to 2.1 kilometers per second. Okay? They're actually pretty consistent. The sedimentary rocks are higher, between 4.7 and 6.1. The metamorphic rocks between 4.9 and 6.9. The igneous rocks between 5.2 and 6.8. And then finally the minerals, all of which are quite a bit higher, except for quartz. Quartz is 6, but it goes up to 11 nearly kilometers per second for corundum. So one thing we notice is that going from minerals to rocks, which are of course made up of lots of minerals, we get a lower seismic wave velocity. As we go from rock to cheese, we get a lower seismic wave velocity, perhaps not that exciting or surprising a result. Now, let's look at a graph. This graph has on the y-axis compressional velocity, that's Vp in kilometers per second, and on the x-axis density, rho, in grams per centimeter cubed. And this shows us once again that our cheeses, which are down here, have low Vp velocities, similar to the 2 lunar rocks. Okay, and terrestrial rocks are up here. What are these 2 curves, though? Let's learn about them. Continuing the paper. It was of some interest to consider the behavior of these lunar rocks in terms of the expected behavior based on measurements of Earth materials. Birch first proposed a simple linear relation between compressional velocity and density for rocks. This relation was examined further by Anderson, who showed that this was a first approximation to a more general relation, derivable from a dependence of the elastic moduli with the density through a power function. Comparison of the results obtained from the returned lunar rocks with the predictions of these relationships expresses graphically the manner they deviate from the behavior of rocks found on Earth. The velocities are remarkably lower than what would be predicted from either the Birch or Anderson relationships. Okay, what this is saying is that the 2 lines we see on the graph, one is linear, Vp equals A plus B times rho, which was Birch's curve, and then the Anderson curve, Vp equals K times rho to the 1.5, so that's a power law relationship. Those curves actually go through most data for terrestrial rocks, which of course typically have densities of around 2.5 to 3.5 grams per centimeter cubed. So if we extrapolate those lines, we end up, coincidentally, going through the values for cheese. The inset to the main figure, by the way, shows you all those different cheeses. And you know, they're not perfectly on one line, but you can see on the scale of the big figure, they actually lie very nicely on the extrapolation of the Vp density relationship for terrestrial rocks. Okay. Now, we've presented the results. Now we move on to the discussion. To account for this very low velocity, we decided to consider materials other than those listed initially by Birch, or more detailed compilation of Anderson and Lieberman. The search was aided by considerations of much earlier speculations concerning the nature of the Moon, reference 7, and a significant group of materials was found which have velocities that cluster about those actually observed for lunar rocks. Okay, so this is where they actually introduced the justification for measuring cheese, and they managed to cite Erasmus, and people love to cite, you know, very famous scientists or eminent people from decades and centuries passed. So this is a pretty cool one, getting a quote from Erasmus in like 1542 about the moon being made of green cheese. A comparison of these low-velocity materials with the predictions of Birch and of Addison is shown in Figure 1. Back to Figure 1, there we go. It is at once apparent that these materials do yield values of velocity that are predicted by these relations for their densities. So just confirming that the cheeses lie on the extrapolated curves fit to terrestrial rocks. Thus the curve of Birch for the rock types diabase, gabbros, and eclogites fit the cheeses surprisingly well. This apparent inconsistency in that the cheeses do obey these relationships by having a velocity appropriate to their density, in contrast to the lunar rocks with which they compare so well, may readily be accounted for when one considers how much better aged the lunar materials are. Okay, so again, saying that the lunar rocks and the cheese have the same density, the lunar rocks also, the cheese also fit on the extrapolated data for the terrestrial rocks, so clearly the logical conclusion would be that the interior of the moon could be made of cheese. It has the right density and it has the correct VP density relationship to fit with Earth rocks. Okay, what's the message behind this paper? I think there are 4 messages we can take from this. The first is that science ought to be fun. The excitement that these guys were feeling at this time, they had, the first person set foot on the moon only a year before. They were getting all this new data back, actual seismic data from another terrestrial body beyond the Earth. It was amazing. And I'm sure at that time they thought that by now, 2013, we would all be flying around in jetpacks and probably have colonies on Mars and the moon and who knows what else. Of course, with the government shutdown and the funding crisis at NASA, those dreams are looking further and further away. But anyway, this still managed to communicate. Science ought to be fun, and it clearly was fun at that time. I think it still is. It's just perhaps a little bit more awkward to get funding. Think outside the box. They had some data that fitted, they had some lunar rock data where the VP velocities look completely wrong. Let's see what other materials might fit with our geophysical information. Evaluate data critically. Okay, so now we have this data. We see that the cheeses fit the low density and they have a low seismic wave velocity, but it extrapolates nicely from the Earth data. So is the moon made of cheese? And then not only evaluate the data themselves, evaluate the interpretations of those data as well. And finally, do always remember that data is plural. Datum is the singular. I'm pretty bad myself at remembering that. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed reading the paper, and I hope it encouraged you to be excited about science and to think critically always.